As the last Dragonborn, you are looking for a way to defeat Alduin. So you follow the instructions of Paarthurnax and bring the Elder Scroll to the Time Wound at the throat of the world. As you open the Elder Scroll at the Time Wound, you are shown a vision of the past. The battle between the three heroes and Alduin. The vision shows you how they managed to banish Alduin. As the vision ends, Alduin appears. He says to you,
My belly is full of the souls of your fellow mortals, Dovahkiin. Die now, and await your fate in Sovngarde.
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we will be discussing Alduin. More specifically, why would anyone choose to worship Alduin and why you may choose to on your next playthrough. To do this, we must first go over several things, starting with who even is Alduin. So what is he known as and what is he associated with? After this, we will move on to Alduin's history. So what historical events has he been involved in? So essentially, what is his legacy? Then we will discuss who worships Alduin, so their beliefs surrounding Alduin and why they worshipped or currently worship him. Finally, we will discuss the aspects of Alduin, so similar deities that present throughout various religions in Tamriel. So let us begin with who is Alduin. Now, when it comes to who is Alduin, the first thing that should be acknowledged is actually his name. So Alduin's name can actually be broken down in the dragon language. Each syllable in his name has a meaning. Al meaning destroyer, Du meaning devour, and In meaning master. If we consider the Nordic belief that Alduin is the dragon who eats the world, the Nords believe that Alduin as a god is supposed to usher in the next cycle. He is their twilight god, being a sign of the end times. Now this also goes along with another of his titles, this being the World Eater, which also comes from the Nord belief that Alduin is the bringer of the end. So many of the names from the human, particularly the Nord descriptions of Alduin, surround his relation to the end time. However, these are not the only names associated with Alduin. There are others which are just as important. Considering that Alduin in his various names is described as a dragon, this influences the claims of where he comes from, with Alduin's own claims being that he was the firstborn of Akatosh. This also goes along with his descriptions in the Song of Gods, where he is referred to as the first dragon, which is another one of his names. Now, whether or not you accept that title as true, it can be viewed as a sort of metaphorical title, considering that Alduin was once considered to be the leader of the dragons. As at the beginning of time, dragons were once wild and uncivilized creatures. However, Alduin would create civilization within the dragons, becoming their leader and ruler of sorts, which is rather evident in the dragon cult and the later dragon war. However, more on this later. So based on who Alduin is, why would anyone choose to worship him? Alduin to the Nords instills fear due to his association with the end of all times, but also with his supposed leadership of the other dragons. However, with Alduin being believed to have destroyed the last world, he is also the reason why the current one exists. So in that respect, Alduin is not just destruction without purpose. Alduin serves the purpose of removing the old and the dying, that which no longer serves, to allow for the new to come in. With his destruction, he allows new life in the next world to exist, the next cycle to take place. Now Alduin also is the one who is said to have brought civilization to the dragons, this eventually flowing on to the people, allowing them to exist in relative peace for a time. So for some, Alduin may represent a better time, even if it requires the ultimate sacrifice, which is why some may worship him. Others may do so more out of fear to appease Alduin than to bring on a new era. But to learn more about why some may worship Alduin, we should discuss the history of Alduin. Now, when it comes to the history of Alduin, we should begin in the Dawn era, as this is where the Nordic beliefs and descriptions of Alduin arise from. A quick note with this, Nords themselves technically did not exist in the Dawn era. However, their ancestors did. And what is important about the Dawn era to the Nords is that this is when they believe this world began. This being after a previous world was destroyed by Alduin, as in their belief he is not only the harbinger of the apocalypse, but also the creator of the next world. He destroys the world in a horrible ravaging firestorm before the next can be born. But anyway, moving on. This still being within the Dawn era. So the dragons were at one point wild and uncivilized. However, Alduin would change this. He would be the one to bring order to the dragons. By creating this civilization, he would become essentially the leader of the dragons, ruling over Mundus before the birth of man. Now, with the creation of mankind, this would eventually extend into the leadership of mankind. We see this with the dragon cult, which would originate in Atmora. Here, these dragon cults and their priests would set the laws that would keep the peace between the humans and the dragons who ruled over them. As for dragons, they were much more powerful than the humans, so the worship helped to keep the peace. But with the move into Skyrim and Tamriel, this would be different. This is where the treatment of humans by the dragons would become much crueler. Now, there is no record as to if this was due to an ambitious dragon priest, a specific dragon, or a series of weak kings. But whatever the reason, the dragon priests would begin to rule over Tamriel with an iron fist. This would turn the rest of the population essentially into slaves. Now, the people would eventually rebel, with the dragon priests being unable to control the masses. This would lead to the beginning of the Dragon War. Now, in the beginning of the Dragon War, there would be men dying by the thousands, as the men who rebelled against the dragons and their priests truly stood no chance. However, the tides would eventually turn with the actions of Paarthurnax. So Paarthurnax, at the beginning of the Dragon War, was Alduin's lieutenant. Because of this, Paarthurnax in the beginning would commit many atrocities against the men. But this would change. Now, depending on the story you believe, will depend on the reason why. As with some records, like with Paarthurnax's own claims, his rebellion against his older brother would be due to Alduin claiming the lordship of Akatosh. Whereas the Nords would claim that the behaviour of Paarthurnax was either willed or ordered by the goddess Kine. Either way, Paarthurnax would betray Alduin, doing this through his teaching of the Thum to mortals. Paarthurnax would teach the leaders of the rebellion, Hakon, Gormlaith, and Feldir. In doing so, he would provide the humans with an ability to defeat Alduin. Now, these Proto-Nords would become increasingly important towards the end of the Dragon War, this being with the group not only fighting dragons loyal to Alduin, but travelling to challenge Alduin himself, as defeating Alduin would actually free the humans. So, at the summit of the throat of the world, these three would wait for Alduin to appear. When Alduin arrived, they would finally confront him. Now, because Alduin was no normal dragon, the regular attacks would not work on him. The group would end up using an Elder Scroll on him. Now, this would banish Alduin. However, this would not destroy him, as it would just create a time wound, sending Alduin forward in time for humans of the future to deal with. Now, although Alduin was banished, his legacy would continue on in the Nordic culture. Even after his banishment, Nords often felt reverence and fear towards Alduin, with many still viewing him as a god. We see this with the dragon totem still being present in the old Nordic religion. Now, there was more of a respect for Alduin rather than an outright worship of him. But anyway, moving on. This being to the year 533 in the First Era, during the reign of King Ysmir Wulfharth. Although Alduin was essentially considered to be dead, or at least banished, there are records of him appearing at times in the history of the Nords, this being recorded in the songs of King Wulfharth. Specifically in the song where he deals with Old Knocker, or Orki as he is better known. Now, at this point in the songs of King Wulfharth, the Nords, who had once had incredibly long lifespans, would have Orki try to ruin the Nords, as Orki happened to be an enemy god. This song claims that Orki would summon the ghost of Alduin again. This would lead to Nords' lifespans diminishing to just 6 years, so Wulfharth would end up begging Shor for his assistance, as Shor was the dead chieftain of the gods. Wulfharth believed that Shor could potentially help his people. This would lead to Shor's own ghost fighting the ghost of Alduin on the spirit plane at the beginning of time. Shor would win this battle. Now, as a result of this battle, King Wulfharth would learn a new shout. The shout being called, "What happens when you shake the dragon just so?" Wulfharth rushed to use this shout to save his people, using the magic of this shout to change them back to normal. However, this would have consequences. Because he had rushed to save so many people, he ended up taking so many years off of his own life. So Wulfharth would grow older than the Greybeards, and he would die from this. Now, there are some claims that it was actually Shaw himself who would remove the curse from the humans rather than Wolfhearth. In this version of the story, Shaw would remove the curse and would throw it onto the nearby orcs instead. Either way, Alduin would be defeated in both versions of the story. Anyway, moving on to later in the First Era, this being to the year 2812. Now this year would be the year when Emperor Raman II would give permission for the construction of Alduin's wall within the Sky Haven Temple. Purpose of this wall was firstly, it was an accumulation of dragon lore, but it was also the presentation of the Dragonborn prophecy. This prophecy foretold Alduin's return. Alduin's wall was finally finished in the year 2818. With the wall being finished, the temple would be sealed with a blood seal. Now, this seal was to prevent the temple from being opened by anyone other than the Dragonborn, allowing the knowledge and the power to be unlocked only by the Dragonborn. But anyway, skipping forward a few eras, as this is where Alduin would return. This being in the 4th era in the year 201. Alduin would reappear at the throat of the world, being cast out of the time wound. Here, Paarthurnax waited for his arrival for thousands of years. However, Paarthurnax was unsuccessful in containing Alduin. This would lead to Alduin descending onto the world. At this time, Alduin would interrupt the execution of several members of the Stormcloak Rebellion, including their leader Ulfric Stormcloak. Within this group, there was also a prisoner who was captured attempting to cross the border, essentially someone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now with this, Alduin would manage to stop the Imperial Legionnaires from executing the prisoner and Ulfric Stormcloak. Alduin would do this by attacking the settlement of Helgen, where the executions were occurring. Alduin would destroy the settlement, reducing it to rubble. Very few would narrowly escape this attack. With Alduin's return and his prevention of the execution of Ulfric Stormcloak, several things would occur. Firstly, the civil war would continue, with more deaths further feeding Alduin in Sovngarde, as Alduin is not only the destroyer of worlds, but he is also the eater of souls. These souls strengthen him. But anyway, Ulfric was not the only survivor of Alduin's attack. There would also be the unfortunate prisoner who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, as it would turn out, that prisoner happened to be the last Dragonborn, mentioned in the Dragonborn prophecy, this being rather important in Alduin's reappearance. Now, outside of the survivors of the initial attack and the extra souls sent to Sovngarde, we would also see another repercussion of Alduin's return. The dragons would return. This would be through the direct actions of Alduin, as he would revive the long-dead dragons, this being done through the power of his thumb. With the presence of Alduin, the dragon priests and the Draugr within the ancient ruins would also begin to come to life. Well, as alive as undead things get. This would really set up the second coming of Alduin's army and the dragon cult, preparing them for this new beginning. But anyway, moving on. With the revival of the dragons, it would require more than just the work of the villagers' strongest to kill them, which is where the last Dragonborn comes in. The last Dragonborn would be required to kill the dragons that Alduin had revived. After killing the dragons, the last Dragonborn would absorb their soul, preventing Alduin from bringing the dragon back to life once again. Now, eventually, the last Dragonborn, with the help of an Elder Scroll, would eventually learn the forgotten shout known as Dragon Rend. This shout would give the last Dragonborn great power when it came to fighting the dragons, and would also assist in the battle against Alduin. So with the last Dragonborn's new powers, they would confront Alduin with the assistance of Paarthurnax at the throat of the world. Now, due to the power and unique nature of Alduin, the duo were unable to defeat him on Mundus. So the last Dragonborn would have to head to Sovngarde to challenge Alduin there, as this is where Alduin had fled to regain his strength after the battle. Here in Sovngarde, the last Dragonborn would meet with Ysgramor and the three heroes who had previously banished Alduin. These three heroes would assist the last Dragonborn in facing Alduin, with the last Dragonborn facing Alduin as the prophecy foretold. These 4 brave warriors would manage to defeat Alduin. So based on the history of Alduin, why would anyone choose to worship him? Well, if we look at the beginning of history, we can see that Alduin supposedly brought civilization to the dragons. Alduin introduced order to the world so that when humans eventually came there would be order in the world. This would allow for the structure, part of this structure being the dragon cult that would be evident in Atmora and Skyrim with the proto-Nords. Now we know with this, it would create the laws for which the interactions between humans and dragons would occur, allowing the two species to coexist in relative harmony. We also know, based on the comments of Parthenax, Alduin would claim power that was not rightfully his, so this being the worship from the ancient Admorans and the Proto-Nords. Considering that Alduin, although he did not rightfully deserve the lordship, he was a rather powerful dragon. We see this through two events. Firstly, the original three heroes, Feldir, Hakon, and Gormlaith, were unable to actually kill Alduin. Instead, they could only send him forward in time, creating a time wound. We also see this with the last Dragonborn initially being unable to defeat Alduin. So from this, people may have desired to worship Alduin due to fear, desiring to appease the destructive World Eater. Now, there is also another reason that is evident. Alduin is said to have been the reason why Mundus exists. He destroyed the previous world so that the new world could exist. So some may feel thankful for his decisions, as he is considered the reason why they exist, and again why civilization exists on Mundus, as he did bring order to the dragons, which would of course flow on to order within the humans. But this does not tell us about Alduin's involvement in religion and prophecies, nor does it tell us about those who have worshipped him. For that, we will need to move on to the worshippers. So when it comes to who worships Alduin, there are several things that should be discussed, as the worship of Alduin is rather complex and somewhat intertwined with the worship of dragons in general. With the worship of Alduin, we should firstly begin with what we know about the Admorans and the Old Nord religion, as this tells us about the religious beliefs surrounding Alduin when it comes to certain groups of humans. Now, if we look at the explanation of the Guardian and the Traitor, this book gives a little insight into what the old Nordic and Atmoran religion was like. It claims that long ago the whole world was ruled over by dragons. This is when they were worshipped as gods by men, having their own dragon cults run by dragon priests who spoke the language and had the ability to use the voice. Now, we also know from other texts that these dragon priests would set down the laws that would define the interactions between humans and the dragons. This had supposedly kept the peace in Atmora. However, with migration into Skyrim, we know that this would change, with the dragon priests being much more controlling and domineering over the people. What is interesting about the dragons' part in this, at least as far as Atmora, the dragons were not truly interested in being active rulers. Yes, they had the physical power to dominate the humans, however, the dragons could not be bothered with the act of ruling. So this was a task for the dragon priests and the kings who would preside over the men. But with the dragon priests becoming more powerful, and then humans underneath rebelling, we see the dragons being more present in their ruling over people. So in this version of worship, it is more of a theocracy, not just a religion. What I mean by this is that the dragons hold the place of a god and are the highest position in the Atmoran and early Nord society. However, they are a living god. Below this, the dragon priests and the kings, with the regular human beings at the very bottom of the society. This, of course, being until the humans who were at the bottom would rebel and banish Alduin. Now, whilst Alduin was still around, there was one location that was important to the dragon cult, especially to Alduin, this being Skuldafn. So this location is where Alduin was able to directly enter Sovngarde to eat the souls of the Nordic dead. It is also where the dragon priests, who were closest to Alduin, were based. They were the right hand of Alduin. This being before Alduin would be banished, and later on High King Harald would end the dragon cult worship in the year 140 in the First Era. But anyway, moving on. Another important thing that should be mentioned when it comes to Alduin is actually the Dragonborn prophecy, as the prophecy of the Dragonborn was important in predicting the return of Alduin. So the prophecy was rather important to religious belief surrounding Alduin. The prophecy of the Dragonborn states, when misrule takes its place at the eight corners of the world, when the brass tower walks and time is reshaped, when the thrice blessed fail and the red tower trembles, when the Dragonborn ruler loses his throne and the white tower fails, when the snow tower lies sundered, kingless, bleeding, the World Eater wakes, and the wheel turns upon the last Dragonborn. Now, the prophecy does sound a little bit out of this world, but let's be real, it has nothing on the work of Vivek. But anyway, we should break this down so we can understand the signs or triggers for the return of Alduin. So the first line of this prophecy, when misrule takes its place at the eight corners of the world. This part of of the prophecy specifically refers to the events surrounding the Staff of Chaos. So this is when, in the late Third Era, the Imperial battle mage Yag-Sothoth would use the Staff of Chaos to imprison the Emperor, Uriel Septim, the 7th, within a realm of oblivion. Then Yag-Sothoth would break the Staff of Chaos into 8 pieces and spread it out throughout Tamriel. Moving on to the next line, when the brass tower walks and time is reshaped. Now this refers to the Numidium and its activation, which would also occur in the late Third Era. With the activation of the Numidium, it would cause an event known as the Warp in the West. So each of the 7 powers in Iliac Bay would take ownership of the Numidium at the same time, and they would all achieve their goals. Well, to some extent. Which is where we get the paradox known as the Warp in the West. Moving on to the next line, when the thrice blessed fail and the Red Tower trembles. So this line refers to the gods of the Tribunal Temple, their eventual downfall, and its beginning with the fulfillment of the Naravarine prophecy. With the fulfillment of the Naravarine prophecy, the Tribunal gods would lose their immortality. Now this is where Bardal would begin to resume its long-awaited fall, its collision course for Vivec City. So Bardal would eventually collide with and obliterate Vivec City. This impact would lead to Red Mountain erupting, which is the event known as the Red Year. Moving on to the next line, when the Dragonborn ruler loses his throne and the White Tower falls. This line references the Oblivion Crisis, as this line predicted the assassination of Uriel Septim the 7th and the Oblivion Crisis that would occur after his death. Now there is another important statement within this line, specifically the White Tower falls. This actually refers to the capture of the White Gold Tower in the Great War between the Aldmeri Dominion and the Empire. Moving on to the next line, when the Snow Tower lies sundered, kingless, bleeding. This line refers to the Skyrim Civil War, this erupting after the death of High King Torrig, as after his death there was debate as to who would be considered the rightful High King of Skyrim. Those loyal to Ulfric Stormcloak would view him as the rightful claimant to the throne, others viewed him as a fraud or saw that he cheated in their battle, which is why the Snow Tower could be considered not only kingless but bleeding, as there would be fighting between the Imperials and the Stormcloaks over it. Moving on to the final line. The World Eater wakes, and the wheel turns upon the last Dragonborn. So Alduin's appearance from the Time Wound and the last Dragonborn's discovery. But anyway, moving on. Now, one of the important things we see with the return of Alduin is the return of the dragons. And for the most part, the dragons were loyal to Alduin. The dragons essentially worshipped Alduin, as after all, Alduin in the past had brought civilization to them, and most recently had brought them back to life. So in this worship, the dragons followed Alduin in his attack against the humans, and also in the times of peace previously. So based on the worshippers of Alduin, why would anyone choose to worship him? When it comes to the supporters of Alduin, we see that those who are close to him are given power. Not as much power as him, but they still have immense power. We see this with the Dragon Priests, who were essentially ruling over the people of Skyrim. So the Dragon Priests were incredibly powerful mages who were provided with even more power in the sense that they were taught and allowed to speak the dragon language. They were also taught the Thum. So for these humans, he provided them with power and the ability to control all who were considered lower than them. For those that would be considered lower than the Dragon Priests, so the normal humans, Alduin, in a sense, would provide safety in the order that he supposedly created. However, he would also create fear, this being in the sense that he could destroy all that these people held dear. Now, for the dragons, Alduin reigned in their chaos and created order. He gave them the capability to harness their power and be treated like gods by the humans. He caused them to be worshipped during their high time. Alduin provided leadership that the dragons were lacking. So for the dragons, Alduin provided the structure that was needed for the dragons to be more than just a group of disorganized beasts. So Alduin provided not only great power, but he inspired much fear, causing many to conform. But this does not tell us about how Alduin may have surfaced across other cultures. For that, we need to discuss the aspects of Alduin. So when it comes to the aspects of Alduin and whether or not he is the same as Akatosh, Alkosh, or even Auriel, it is important to bring up the Nords. Now, after the banishing of Alduin, we do still see Nords recognizing Alduin's godhood, or at least his fierceness. We see this with an essay written by a Nord. So this essay explains what they believe are the differences between Akatosh and Alduin. I will preface this by saying the Nord Thromgar Ironhead said, was not a scholar. He would be considered rather uneducated, so this work is more of an opinion piece, which I will put on the screen and explain. Thrumgar's work does have some errors, so be prepared. And what I must do is set the record straight about the god called Akatosh and the dragon called Alduin. They are not the same thing, no matter what Imperials might say, or how they might wish it to be so. My dad even told me the story of Martin Septim, and the things that happened when the gates of Oblivion opened. Septim turned into the spirit of Akatosh and killed Mehrunes Dagon. Now, I don't know about you, but any dragon that fights the Prince of Destruction is okay by me. Akatosh is some kind of spirit dragon, I think, when he bothers to be a dragon at all, and not a god living in some kind of god place like Oblivion. But Alduin is a real dragon, with flesh and teeth and a mean streak longer than the White River. So with this, it indicates that in the Nordic belief, that Alduin and Akatosh are different entities. One is protective of their patrons, saving their lives when the world was at risk of being destroyed by Daedric invaders, only appearing when needed most, not when most wanted, sort of like Nanny McPhee. The other desires to destroy the world. No prizes for guessing who is who. So for the Nords, Akatosh and Alduin are two completely different entities. This also makes sense with both Alduin's and Parthenax's own claims. These being that Alduin is the firstborn child of Akatosh rather than Akatosh himself. So alongside of Thrumgar's essay or book, we also see an opinion presented by the High Priest of the Akatosh Chantry. Now I should preface this by saying a few things about the High Priest. Firstly, due to the High Priest being based in Wayrest, it is highly unlikely that the priest is a Nord, making them more likely to be a Breton or even an Imperial. This is especially evident with their comments about Auriel and Alduin. So the High Priest instead asserts that Alduin is just another version of Akatosh. The reason why the Nords claim that they are different is that the Nords are primitive and don't understand the goodness and greatness of the Great Dragon, even if Alduin claims to be the child of Akatosh. Anyway, to the book written by the High Priest. In his book, he recognizes that the Nords believe in both Akatosh and Alduin, with the Nords having the same beliefs surrounding Akatosh as those who worship the divines. The scholar learning this from speaking to several Nords, including a highly respected chief. Now the scholar would call into question the reliability of the Nords' accounts of Alduin being a dragon king of sorts, his attack against humans, his organization of the dragons, and the devouring of human souls. The scholar claims that the way the Nords pass down their history is unreliable, and that Alduin is essentially the boogeyman of bedtime stories, a sort of mass hysteria that has spread throughout all of the Nords. In the educated and incredibly biased opinion of the High Priest of Akatosh, Alduin is Akatosh, and these stories are simply twisted as the Nords were too primitive to understand how great Akatosh is. Now this does completely ignore the existence of Alduin's Wall, which was constructed within the First Era. It is more likely, especially from the differences in behaviour of both Akatosh during the Oblivion Crisis and Alduin during the time of the Last Dragonborn, that these are two separate entities, and that the High Priest had his own inherent biases that he could not see past. But anyway, moving on. Now when it comes to the other aspects of Alduin, this is when other cultures come into play, having their own sort of destroyer of worlds, also playing into the idea of the cycle of the world. An example of this being Alkan from the Khajiit mythology, the pre-Redata religion that is. Alkan is known as the Scaled Prince. So in the Khajiit myth, the explanation for Alkan's existence differs from the Nords in that Alkan is instead the firstborn of Akka, the first cat and a demon of fire and shadow. Like Alduin, Alkan has the ability to devour the souls of those he kills, and with this he is said to grow to an immense size. Along with this, Alkan was said to have been slain by Lorkhaj and his companions. However, it is said that Alkan, being immortal, was likely to return, with this just being a matter of time. Now, what is interesting about this version of Alduin is that he is considered to be an enemy of Alkosh, rather than the child of Alkosh, as Alkosh is the Dragon King, so the Khajiit form of Akatosh. But anyway, moving on to the next destroyer of worlds, this being over to the Skull. Just briefly, the Skull are an isolated group of Nords on Solstheim that have their own religious beliefs. So in their religious beliefs, they have a god known as the Allmaker, who provides all that is needed for the Skull. But they also have the Adversary. So the Adversary is another omnipresent figure, always watching. The Adversary enjoys tormenting the Allmaker and their chosen people. The Adversary is said to have many forms, one of these being Thartag, the World Devourer. So Thartag is described as appearing in the Unholy Beasts, and incurable plagues, along with the end of seasons. So Thartag, to avoid bringing bad luck, is more commonly called the Greedy Man by the Skull. Now, there is a legend within the Skull that involves the Greedy Man. In this story, there is a man who supposedly lives alongside the Skull for several months. Then one day, the Skull noticed that all of the gifts given to them by the All-Maker are gone. So the warriors have no strength. The shamans can no longer summon beasts. The Skull thought that this was the work of the All-Maker abandoning them. However, the Greedy Man would come forward and confess, telling them that the Skull must go out and find the missing gifts that he had stolen. So for several days and nights, the Skull would argue over who would be the one to retrieve the missing gifts. This would be until a young man named Avar would speak up, volunteering to go. Avar would manage to convince the Skull that he was the best choice. Then he would head out to retrieve the gifts. First retrieving the gift of water by following a black hawker known as the Swimmer, swimming deep down into a dark cave in the ocean. Then Avar would go to hear the Song of the Earth, doing this by heading to the Cave of Hidden Music. Here inside of the cavern, Avar would hear a faint song in this cavern. So Avar would use his mace to strike the rocks to the beat of the song, amplifying the sound. This retrieved the gift of the earth. Then Avar would go in search of the good beast to put an end to its suffering, eventually finding a bear with an arrow from a falmer in its neck. Avar would help the bear by pulling the arrow out and using magic to heal it. The bear would then protect Avar as he slept, killing Falmer. This retrieved the gift of the beasts. Anyway, after helping the good beast, Avar would go on to search for seeds to replant the first tree. Avar would search through the forest, initially finding nothing, so he would talk to the tree spirits, which are Spriggans. They told him to search deeper in the forest for a Falmer who was hiding the seeds. Avar would find the seeds with the Falmer and several bewitched Spriggans. So Avar decided that he would need to collect the seeds in secret. To do so, he would set a fire to distract the group. Then he would sneak behind the Falmer and grab the seeds. Avar would plant the seed, retrieving the gift of the trees. Then Avar would head to the halls of Penumbra. Here he would carefully wander through the darkness, avoiding the unholy beasts, these being the ice trolls, until he came upon the light. When he came upon the light, he would use the flaming eyeball of one of these unholy beasts to break ice it was hidden behind. The ice would slowly break, releasing light throughout the halls, burning and blinding the unholy beasts. This would return the gift of the sun to the Skull. Finally, Avar would search for the Greedy Man to retrieve the final gift, this being the gift of the winds. However, he would not find him in the trees, near the oceans, in the deep caves, or even in the forests. Eventually, Avar would find a crooked house, which he knew that the Greedy Man would be inside of. Avar would enter, confront the Greedy Man, and tear open his bag. The winds would sweep up the Greedy Man, carrying him far away from the island. And with that, the gift of the winds was returned. Avar, having completed his quest, would return home to Skull Village. So based on the story of Avar, the Skull version of Alduin doesn't sound to be a dragon per se. However, he is still considered to be the destroyer of worlds. It is even suggested in the story that Thartag, or the Greedy Man, could have been possessed, which is why he was able to live amongst the Skull, going unnoticed by them initially. Either way, their version of Alduin works as an adversarial spirit, one that is testing them and just waiting for them to become complacent. He is also said to be the devourer of worlds, like Alduin. But anyway, moving on. This being over to Hammerfell, with the Yukuden pantheon, more specifically the god known as Sadakal. So Sadakal is sometimes attributed as only a god of the crowns. Either way, in the Yukuden belief, Sadakal is described as the Worldskin, the Yukuden god of everything. He is considered to be a fusion of Anu and Padme. So Sadakal is believed to destroy the world to begin the next, much like the Nordic Alduin, which is where this comparison comes from, devouring the world each time. It is believed that Sadakal has done this many times before. The spirits that are said to survive this are the other gods of the Yukuden pantheon, the Yukudens being the Red Guards. Now, there are actually worshippers of Sadakal, both in the Red Guards and the Marama. With Sadakal, the worship of him seems to be an acceptance of mortality and coming to peace with the idea of one day you shall die, like one day the world will end. This being important in their beliefs, because the denial of the end is the denial of the beginning. So based on the different aspects of Alduin, why would anyone choose to worship him? Well, with Sadakal and the beliefs surrounding him, it brings a new light to Alduin. Without death, there is no life. Both of these gods represent endings becoming new beginnings, which is why Sadakal is worshipped. Now, if we take into account the work of Thromgar Ironhead, where he indicates the differences between Akatosh and Alduin, with Akatosh being presented as a hero of the people and Alduin being painted as more of a dark and evil dragon that exacts revenge, this presents Alduin as more of a god that is appeased rather than one who is viewed with love. So based on who Alduin is, his history, who worships him alongside his aspects, we can finally answer the question, why would anyone choose to worship Alduin? Now, if we look at the aspects of Alduin, like that of Thartag, the World Devourer, who they also call the Greedy Man, we see that, although he is not worshipped, it is more that he inspires gratitude from the Skull. The Greedy Man inspires them to appreciate what they have. We see this with the story of Avar, as the Skull lost everything for being lazy and complacent. They had to work hard to get it back. We also see something similar in another aspect of Alduin, this being Sadakal. With Sadakal, he reminds his worshippers to be present and to recognize their mortality. Sadakal teaches followers not to take their time for granted because their time will end. So these aspects highlight that those who do not show appreciation are at the highest risk of losing it all. We also see this in the history of Alduin, when the humans revolted against the dragons. Initially, this seems just like ungrateful humans who were protected from the dragons, and this being them losing it all. No, it was ungrateful dragon priests who abused their power until the people would no longer tolerate it. And now dragon priests are just an undead thing of the past after losing the dragon war. So what is interesting about this historical power shift is that although Alduin and the dragons were once worshipped through the dragon cults, the obligations and ruling were really left up to the dragon priests after Alduin had initially organized dragons and then eventually humans, meaning that he did not have the control that he seemed to have. So the dragon priests are more responsible in their actions for the loss of Alduin and dragon worship than Alduin truly is. Yes, he does have responsibility in the sense that he allowed them to rule with an iron fist and mistreat the humans. But anyway, it is somewhat explainable with Alduin's nature, as his name means destroyer, devourer, master, not destroyer, devourer, leader. Alduin wanted to be worshipped as a king without putting in the work to be one. He wanted to inspire fear with the beliefs surrounding his World Eater title. So for many, the worship of Alduin was more to do with appeasing a god who could destroy their world like he had done to so many others before. For others, it was appreciation for the order he had brought by taming his fellow dragons, introducing civilization and allowing the interactions between humans and dragons to be peaceful for quite some time. However, for others who worship the aspects they may worship, revere or appreciate a similar god to Alduin because he reminds them to be present and appreciate their mortality. To understand that although endings are hard, good things often come in from what has ended. For others, he reminds them to be grateful for all they have, to recognize the value in the littlest of things, because with just the blink of an eye, it can all disappear. So you yourself may choose to worship Alduin because you are a dragon priest who has been provided great powers in working with him, or because you appreciate the ending always brings a new beginning. So let me know in the comments if you would worship Alduin. A special thank you to all of our lore archaeologist supporters. You guys help keep this channel running. And thank you to anyone who is joining our memberships. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, you should check out this one. It is about Mehrunes Dagon and why anyone would choose to worship him.